Mm. Do you have access to it? I don't think they have to see the judge for this. Did you get it?
Charge have to go. I'll fix that. This just needs to be assigned. Did you already start? So what do you need me to do? You already put in the link?
Mhm.
Okay, so what did you do? Or
I might go with someone downstairs.
oh yeah, looks like something with music. That's a heavy jack there. Yeah. Something with music tag. Thought I'd check with.
Is this the right room?
Yes.
Sick.
So yours. Research progress. it's not physically. Yeah, I was going to say it's like the cubbies.
I don't know how I do it.
Here, come on. We share, Sam.
Oh,
That's be the only sad person.
I don't know, it feels a lot more like real, and
Like around.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not fun.
It's so hard to get a rare look at someone and I don't know.
Don't worry, they're not looking at you. I get it.
I don't think it's much like everyone else.
I think so. Do you want to check?
Back up.
Is the judge on Zoom throwing?
I don't think
There's
they
not
checked.
a on Zoom, they're both.
Oh, my bad. Sorry about that.
We've just preconditioned you. to not think of it.
Yeah, so a quick content warning form. Our case includes a short non-graphic description of human trafficking and mental health problems. And send it in an email chain if both judges and both competitors can respond that way. It states anonymous. That would be great. All right, cool. That's our case. I'm gonna make it. Everyone. All right. Time begin. Now, primary structural announcements first one focus on existential threats creates policy paralysis that prevents solutions for human suffering. Jackson 12 writes these threats are one big con designed to distract you from things that can really hurt you, such as structural violence. National security primary function is to distract you from structural and inequalities in society, which are the real threat to your health and well-being of you and your family, to convince you to be permanently afraid so you will acquiesce on the safety measures to keep you under state control of the military-industrial complex ticking. You're much more likely to die from any form of structural violence. Thus, Cuomo 96 writes that crisis-based politics are problematic because they distract attention away from the need for sustained resistance to systems of oppression that function as given in most people's lives. 2. 2, big stick impacts always serve to protect elite voices in their status quo power over marginalized communities. McDonald 08. A focus on threat of communities articulated only in institutionalized voice by at least such a focus serves to marginalize the experience of articulation of the powerless in global politics, presenting them passive recipients lead discourse contributing to the silencing of marginalized voices. They need to address the framing in the next speech or as a mechanism to weigh it around. They don't let them shift their framing throughout the speech. One, it creates a time skew for us to respond since they speak second, and two, it creates less clash in the debate if you allow them to avoid the framing until second summary. Contention-wise housing discrimination. Despite recent efforts, Friedman 15 reports that annually 4 million people experience discrimination in rental housing market. Social media has made it worse. Moore's 22 raised digital redlining is becoming the new frontier for discrimination as social media platforms use personal data to target ads based on protected traits. Luckily, the issue is fixable. Sylvian 21 writes that Section 230 creates a disincentive to care rather than the incentive to self-regulate. It leaves consumers without any legal mechanisms to mitigate informational harms, holding companies responsible would shift some of the costs of unlawful content as the entity best equipped to prevent them. We're also remind furthers that the CBA has turned the internet into a hotbed for housing discrimination by allowing interactive computer services to circumvent Section 3604. There are methods of monitoring posts that to ensure housing advertisements are valid under FHA, such as an automated screening and user-based notification programs. Independently, Section 230 prevents plaintiffs from even having a defendant. Ross writes that anonymous messages may leave victims of housing discrimination without a defendant. Overall, Ross concludes that the CDA has eviscerated the FHA and left victims of housing discrimination without a formal recovery. The impact is improving health. Yang 17 writes that discrimination in housing markets may force individuals to live in undesirable areas or homes. Some standard housing have exposures to chemicals predictive of the diseases. Perceived discrimination in housing markets may also lead to feelings of psychological stress and eventually lead to poor overall health. Contention 2 is trafficking. American social media platforms are increasing trafficking. And Sheriff 22 writes in 2020 that a 125% increase in recruitment to traffic in Facebook and a 95% increase in Instagram. Sheriff used social media to scout and use online job boards and employment websites to recruit them through false advertisements. Sylvian 21 finds that companies that disincentive to moderate. Even if they knew or previously anticipated consumers would use their services to do harm, Section 230 disincentivizes moderation. Furthermore, Steinberg 22 writes the interpretation of Section 230 meant that companies were not liable for trafficking, course would routinely dismiss cases. Luckily, authority creates an incentive to moderate content. Steinberg continues that it would have immediate significant impact companies to be liable. Section 230 immunity would no longer extend to these cases. This would significantly broaden liability for trafficking. Any and all safety measures are key. UNODC 21 notes that the internet is the most common place where victim recruitment takes place. Alton 17 writes that symptoms of depression and PTSD are reported by 78% of women survivors. Contention 3 is terror. GTI 23 finds that attacks become more deadly with lethality rising by 26%. In social media strategy, Share 23 quantifies that Instagram and Facebook play key roles in radicalizing and mobilizing about 90% of terrorists, actually a 40% increase. DeWitt 22 writes that without Section 230, platforms face liability and take content down to avoid the possibility of facing a lawsuit. Companies would be forced to use new technology and invest in innovation. Freelich 18 throws out a greater liability regime would cause a key lifeline for ISIS and other terrorist organizations. An exemption from Section 230 would increase incentives for ISPs to innovate and develop new solutions to avoid liability by combating the threat of terror on social media. The impact is ethnic minorities. U.S. Department of Treasury 22-23 finds that the terrorists cause structural violence as groups like ISIS committed numerous abuses of human rights and violations of international humanitarian law against women, children, including involving killing and sexual violence.
Okay, we'll take a little bit of prep starting. Number 26. It's gonna be like framework and then. I don't know why it's saying error, but let me try. There we go. There we go.
Did everyone get that?
Just got it.
Just.
Will be on their framework and then just adjust it. Not ready? Wonderful. On the framework, firstly, if you have a specific scenario, then we can circumvent. Secondly, they don't actually define crisis politics. Their usage of terrorism is also crisis politics. Thirdly, the McDonald evidence says that overgeneralizations are bad, which we don't do. If anything, that means you reject their framework because its claims are threats or without specific analysis. They're doing their own claim, but then contention one is social movements. Protests are increasing globally. As Corrupt and Harnett 23 found that the tide of protests across the globe continued in 2023. The year's largest demonstrations were in response to assault on democracy, which is why U.S. democracy is stable. As democracy of 25, the elections are being held properly, participation rates are high, and administrations remain accountable. American democracy is highly responsive. The positive trends global. As around 25, the world's freedom recession may be bottoming out. Authoritarian regimes suffered a series of blows, devastatingly affirming eliminated social movements. As Grant 25, that under Section 230, platforms may not be held liable for the content posted by others. Movements like Me Too and BLM may not have been able to catch on, and platforms are worried that they'd be sued for defamation or other claims. Platforms would have had their voices censored. An app causes social movements to be ineffective in two ways. Firstly, censoring information that begins movements. As Signor 25, that videos of horrific police violence against Black Americans went viral on platforms sparking protests in all 50 states would have been actively impeded without Section 230. Without Section 230, George Floyd's final words would have been blocked from social media platforms along with the countless accounts of Black people. Secondly, destroying communication. As Granite 23 finds that platforms must organize content in order to display it in a useful manner. If Section 230 doesn't apply, platforms will be incentivized to present information in a disorganized jumble that lawyers can be certain wouldn't inspire anyone to sue. Section 230 has enabled platforms to host a speech of activists and organizers. Without it, the internet would be a far less hospitable place for collaboration. The authoritarian leaders will create a lack of communication, as Stefan Work 22 finds. Building broad-based movements take organizers capable of helping groups understand approaches and support learning across spaces. Building connective tissue will puncture the divide and conquer strategy of the authoritarian playbook, and movements successfully keep governments responsive. As Daniel 23 find that more than 30 states have passed 140 reform laws since Floyd's killings. Law restricted no-knock warrants, neck restraints, and mandated body cameras. And mass movements are crucial to dismantling autocracies. As Kendall Hero 22 find that social media making it easier to challenge unresponsive governments. Between 2000 and 2017, protests unseated 10 autocracies. Protests have become the single most challenge that the 21st century authoritarian regimes face. The impacts of global democracy, as Diamond 21 continues, that if U.S. disfigures its democracy, autocratically places upon the American president as justification. Democracy in the United States determines the fate of democracy around the world, and this anti-democratic transfers violence, as Diamond 19 finds that famine and genocide are the curse of authoritarian states, state collapse, civil war. It is not democracy supporting terrorism, proliferating weapons of mass destruction, or threatening the territory of their neighbors. Contention to is digital authoritarianism. The United States is expanding technological cooperation with Europe, as the White House 23 finds that the fourth meeting of the TC took place in Sweden. The United States and EU reiterated the central role in promoting international rules-based order on technology, AI, and online platforms. And Blair 22 confirms that the Biden administration announced the Declaration for the Future of the Internet, likely one up, waiving democracies from internet transgression by 61 nations aspiring to protect human rights and freedom of expression. Cut hard. Repealing 230 puts the U.S. in violation of numerous trade deals, affecting credibility of future agreements, as Element 20 finds that. Repealing 230 puts the United States in violation of trade deals with Japan, the only consequently weakening other countries' faith that the United States honors its international agreements, which pose a problem for any future efforts to coordinate with the EU on privacy and content regulation. That would be erosion of the ability for the United States to live up to a bargain and then turn around into the opposite. And U.S.-EU alignment is key to countering digital authoritarianism, as Margaret 21 finds that the cottage industry has sprung up and around sketching the modalities of potential democratic tech alliances for tackling techno authoritarian challenge by China. But without a solid EU-US double helix at its core, it's difficult to see how these efforts will collect capacity needed to succeed. The alternative is global authoritarianism, as Under 20 finds. That technologies will be integrated into all-encompassing surveillance systems that will dictators can plug and play, could prevent billions of people across the globe from ever securing any measure of political freedom. And Polaka and Russell 19 confirms that the global demand for Beijing's model of digital authoritarianism will likely only grow if liberal democracies do not present an alternative. And the exploitation of digital authoritarianism threatens the United States power, as Branson and Beckley 22 find that. Think of the data collection and messaging power of Facebook and Twitter. Now imagine that in the hands of the CCP. Chinese surveillance technology is not a substitute for genocide. It is an enabler. American power and security would be diminished in a more authoritarian world. That came to 19 finds as China's political rise continues down the road. The United States will time to contain it in order to maintain its own hegemony. And Qatar, Talmud 17 finds that Chinese nuclear escalation events potential war to the United States significant risk. Nuclear escalation gain military advantage. 14 finds that small nuclear war cause catastrophic disrupts global climate, mass destruction of the ozone. Thus, we negate.
There's a step across.
Yes.
Actually, camera probably can't see that.
Better stand up front.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
All right. Time to start now. Is there a link on C2, like exportation of technology or hedge?
It's, for example, the ability for the United States and the EU to be able to counter an increasingly digital authoritarian world. If they're not collaborating on regulations and privacy, then people will turn to China more, and the spread of like a crackdown
So
of freedom of crackdown.
It's using Chinese technology instead of US EU technology.
Not necessarily. It's not a free and open internet. If that's not existing, and the United States isn't like countering China with the existence of free Atlantic like,
So
privacy regulations, then
EU,
they can't
US
counter.
co-op is the only thing keeping the internet online.
We'd say that's the only thing countering digital authoritarianism, but
So
also
otherwise, like Chinese
We've
hedge
got a couple
funds.
follow-ups.
I'm just
so-
like trying to get the link because you like dodged around
Yes,
like on
no,
this.
I haven't. I've been
Well, you got it
pretty
in a circle at least.
No, I've been pretty explicit in saying it's about them being able to counter digital authoritarianism on the rise, but
All right,
let's,
so it's hedge.
no, I'll take another question though.
Fine.
So let's talk about your scenario of terrorism.
Mhm.
So on the like specific link, is it about addressing terrorist radicalization in the United States or like in what countries?
It's US and internationally.
So like what predominant countries are like we're seeing this rather like radicalization occurring?
I'd say you see it in the US and West Asia as well.
In a lot of West Asia. Does
US
any of-
and West Asia.
Sure. So does any of your evidence actually say that these like people are like terrorists are being radicalized outside of like the Western
Yeah.
world?
That's the uniqueness of the science that 90% of all terrorists that are going into terror activity are recruited through social media, both domestically and internationally.
Wait, that 90% says lone wolf terrorists, correct?
No, I don't think so.
Wait,
You try to hold those.
Sure.
But even if it
It
is,
is-
even if it is like lone wolf terrorists, it's still causing like massive ethnic crime, like causing ethnic minorities harm.
all right.
And it
Okay.
doesn't say, yeah, it doesn't even say lone wolf. Okay,
Yeah, it
Um,
does. It says 90% of lone terrorist actors.
okay, but so 90% of terrorist actors, like,
No, lone wolf terrorist actors.
doesn't say
because
lone wolf, it says lone terrorist actors. So people
Yeah.
who operate alone, 90% of that is
Yeah,
through social
that's
media.
the
So
same.
90% of the people who do attacks by themselves happens through social media. That's still a bad thing. It still causes structural violence.
All right, but I
Analysis.
just want to clarify. it's
Our
not-
impact is specific to structural violence.
Yeah,
So it's not like a massive, like, terror is gonna like kill the world.
yeah, I just want to clarify what your argument was about.
I mean, sure, we'd also argue that like insofar as 90% of global terrorist activity happens, that means a lot happens outside of it. On your argument about like destroying communication, right? So how does like section 230 actually like, kill communication? Like in what way?
Yes, because these companies are held liable for how they organize information, because then the third-party content is, like, they are the creators of the third-party content, and then they can't organize and prioritize certain pieces of information.
We'll take a little bit of problem. Starts.
Also,
I'll send the doc.
Thank you.
Cool. That sounds good. There's gonna be stuff like off the top. Framing documents.
I got it.
Hello.
Yeah.
Are we good?
Where's this one?
It's framing then that case. Extend our framing. Our arguments that basic impacts like the affirmative always attract all the urgency from solving for structural violence, although they have no chance of happening. Criminal finds that politicians use basic fears to ignore structural violence. McDonald finds that institutionally shut up voices and marginalized via big stick we never get to talk about and solve high probability ongoing still violence, which why this is there's no warrant why their scenarios and fear mongering is uniquely different than all the other threats that inevitably pop up. Also, McDonald finds that all their Lincoln shouldn't apply because they still rely on dominant elites that constantly promise their impact will benefit those at a structural disadvantage, even though it empirically never does. And B, you should be able to justify oppression in one instance if they prove that their impact links in some way to another form of structural violence be reimposed. They did not offer a counter role, counter like framing mechanism at all. At that point, you're probably defaulting structural violence, and you're looking towards arcade first. They have also conceded you should not be allowed to read new stuff in second rebuttal because it's given us it gives them a huge time skew against us. At that point, you default SB. Top shelf. The first thing I say is that if we win specific scenario, we circumvent. Our Jackson evidence indicates the most probable impact to occur is always the ongoing violence that perpetuates everyday life and most likely to even kill someone. That the distraction boogeyman of security threats designed to distract people from the real more important harms of SC. Even if specific Jackson analyzes saying it still has low probability, he analyzes all specific avenues and says SV is the only real threat. Second, they say that we don't define crisis politics. Crisis politics generally accepted is the idea that some big impact will have. If we went for big, our argument on the second response saying that we don't define crisis politics, it's pretty simple. Which word is it?
Just read it word for word. This.
Oh, crisis politics generally accepted by the idea that some big stick will happen, causing a crisis wave for big stick to take off. The terror would be a crisis politics. We're talking about individual attacks that are structural violence. Third, they say McDonald says overgeneralization are bad, which we don't do. Are not what McDonald says. This is when elite discouraged doesn't focus on the real issues. He's specifically talking about big stick leading to structural violence, not overgeneralization on impacts happening. Go to their case. On social movements, not over censoring. One, there's no impact. False positives of expedited appeals. That happen 21 rates that almost all large platforms offer appeal systems. Facebook information and operation appeal system and proactively restored content after appeal. High status NGOs and users who efficiency is demonstrated. Second, backlash saws Del Campo continues that responses to the increase in automation and during COVID, YouTube suspending the strike system, anticipating errors. YouTube reincorporated significant human resources assigned to moderation on the jumbling link. One won't do it. It makes their business model collapse. If Twitter is this disorganized and all the users will go to Facebook, they would rather take a little bit of legal fees hit than have their platform corrupt. Second, most forms of structural violence can't be jumbled because they're just group chat. There's no way WhatsApp will make it possible for this to just send each other messages in a group chat on about locations for protests. Third, platforms are already difficult to organize on two warrants. A, there's so many fake or inactive groups and pages on platforms like Facebook that it makes finding them tricky. B, it's really hard to find specific social movements or causes. The search term required are super specific and hard to reach. On the impact level, one in-person organizing stalls. Just Semi 11 finds that of the day of the Arab Revolution, social media was just one of the channels big tech corporations have insidiously used to miss, and social media is the Arab strength to expand and counter criticism. But secondly, democratic backsliding is the worst it's ever been. Best studies through DI-23 finds that democracy across every region of the world has continued to contract in the sixth consecutive year. On EU. One, we already break arguments with Channel 23 finds the Trump administration blocked new judges in the WTO, and the WTO ruled that terrorists and steel violated WTO agreements. Biden's violently rejected the idea, saying the United States will not see decision making over. Their impact still didn't trigger. Second, their impact is no internal link work. There's no more as to why U.S. leadership is key to existential threats and why another actor like China or Europe can't step up. Why the EU's relationship is uniquely key. But third, there's not unique. Nobody trusts the U.S. already because their internal link evidence is talking about credibility, but political instability happens regardless. We flip flop on agreements like the Paris Accords, and they know with power change they're going to happen regardless. But secondly, once again, there's no link. Repealing 230 would supersede USMC, and the US wouldn't get sued by big tech. What's that? All their evidence is talking about. Check choice 20 times USMC is only a handful of agreements. US decided to extend and test the TPA. No provision of a trade agreement will prevent Congress from modifying US law. At that point, you know that it doesn't hurt our EU relationship. Fifth, specifically US-EU tech relations, it's not unique. Selly 21 finds that US and the EU are not aligned. This divide out as the US and EU tech law for recent shift in the heightened political divergence between Washington and Brussels. That's why you can turn a repealing alliance with Europe, solving relations. As Selly 21 continues, Section 230's legislative proposals resemble thinking of the EU, where policymakers protect consumers, increase interest, and greater achieve alignment with European allies, offers an opportunity for transatlantic cooperation.
You have,
Is it 26? So is that
34. Yeah. We'll take that right now.
So we have two of them.
Also in the doc, it's just gonna be, like framing our case, their case. Just stuff on framing isn't like off of a doc, but it'll be pretty slow. Just something like that.
Is the responses to our framing or back on your framework? Stuff that you wrote.
Yours. Our stuff was on yours too.
Okay.
You got it?
Good.
Okay, awesome. Cool. SB framework really doesn't mean anything because our entire case is about SB. Remember, our contention 1 is specifically about activism checking back against abuses. For example, Black Lives Matter or Me Too, those are structural issues. And they can see the impact on our contention 2, that it means that China is able to export genocide, which is definitionally structural violence. So even if we didn't read a counter framework, we always link in. They have not told you what specific big threats that we are perpetuating. They are the only ones reading a terrorist scenario, which their own Jackson evidence says is an example of the bad threat construction. We are not reading basic impacts. We're not doing crisis politics. There is just no nuance or specificity. They keep reading the same things off big dog without engaging with our actual responses. Then, on our case, on social movement specifically, the first thing they say is that there's appeals and there's backlash. First, per their own evidence systems, do not care about marginalized groups or people of color, so they're always going to come down on the side of the big tech corporations. You should not give them the tools to do that. But second, the majority of people doing these don't have the resources to file massive lawsuits against these companies. It's much more likely that big technology is able to win. Then, they say that it would destroy their business model, but all of the companies are doing this. They don't want to get sued. They know that litigation would be way worse, so they display it all in a jumble. Things like hashtags, hashtags are able to spread it. And even if they're already in group chats, it doesn't matter because specifically having the information widely available is what increases the scope of accessibility. It's historically worked, which is why they can see that BLM is making progress right now. Then, even if then you can, the only way you find out about in-person protests from social media, and our democracy evidence analyzes data from 2023, theirs from 2022, and ours finds the post-COVID trends of backsliding or decreasing. On digital authoritarianism, the first thing they say is we break deals already, but their evidence isn't specific to deals with the EU, specifically with them. We're upholding Section 230, which is critical to our relations. Then they say there's no internal link because it's not key. Yes, it is. When we destroy data sharing right now, we're doing negotiations, but in the affirmative world that goes away, we look like we don't keep our agreements, which directly decrease the amount. They say that there's no trust. There is because they did negotiations. The next thing they say is it supersedes literally no warrant here insofar as the deals of provisions from Section 230 are baked into trade deals, violating them destroys credibility. Then on the last turn, our evidence is 2 years more recent and finds we're already doing the TTC, which their own evidence concludes is what's needed. So relations are good right now, and there's no uniqueness on the turn. On their case on housing, first, there's no link. Section 230 doesn't protect digital redlining. Benavides 23 finds that the court ruled that Facebook can be sued for discriminating in housing advertisements. Major victory for digital civil rights. Facebook's claim of immunity under Section 230 doesn't apply, which you prefer. It's more recent than any of their evidence. Second, Turnip politicizing. O'Sullivan 19 finds that gutting Section 230 would politicize internet activity, as websites would need to submit to the whims of whatever political party is in power. Removing liability protection would make online content production inherently subjective, which links in it causes massive gridlock, so we can never pass legislation to check back against redlining. On trafficking, first, it's not unique. It's been on the decline. Portal 23 finds compared to 2019, the total number of victims detected in 2020 decreased by 11%. Second, Turner worsening sex work. Alberta 21 finds people in these sex trades have been forced into dangerous and potentially life-threatening scenarios, no longer have access to affordable methods of advertising and have returned to outdoor work, which I was on probability. It's empirics about the last provisions exempting trafficking from 230. That was a mini version of the affirmative and severity. It targets the most marginalized. Third, Turner offshoring. 23 finds that sex trafficking has simply moved overseas or underground. 64% of survivors have experienced an increase in force since the logic effect, which I was on severity because there's no enforcement in other countries. Four, Turner survivor identification. Alberta 21 finds that amendments impede efforts to identify AIDS survivors can no longer use these sites to find missing victims, which I was on severity of trafficking is inevitable. You should at least decrease the time frame that people are trafficked in on time because their terrorist evidence says it's online because of COVID, but since that's over, they should back to in person, so identification is key. On terror. First, terrorism is incredibly unlikely. Their authors are propagandists. Greenwald 12 finds that terrorism experts have built their careers on fear-mongering over Islamic terrorism and can stay relevant only if that threat does sustained by ugly sentiments of Islamophobic bigotry. Continuing that attached to think tanks, academia, media outlets, the industry say fraud, which you prefer because terrorism is the exact threat that their Jackson evidence is criticizing. Second, turn it. Censorship worsens radicalization. Landell 21 finds that censorship mechanisms exacerbate radicalization, motivate individuals who seek others with similar beliefs, creation of new, relatively isolated online communities of substantial size extremist views, swept under the carpet, which outline severity because they don't encounter anyone, and magnitude because it pushes them towards physical needs. But third, turn it. Moderation is bias. Color and Duke 22 find that over-enforcement hitting users who are speaking Arabic are talking about Islam, which outweighs on probability because it's historical, but for their impact, it's about ISIS dominance in the Middle East, but their link is about Muslims in the US. There's no link to the SB scenario.
We'll take a breath.
We'll start time. Yeah.
Thing is, look at this, because I wrote this. Oh, all right, well, you figure it out too.
And yeah, just do it.
I don't know. I didn't, I got this one. You
All right, that's 40 seconds.
Cool. Great for talks.
Yeah, honestly.
Like how much?
That's fine.
That's
I'm
one
gonna stand on. Do you want the first question? I mean, you don't have to.
Yeah. Let's talk about C1.
Yeah.
So what's your like jumbling, like explain it?
Yeah, for sure. So our argument is that in the world of the affirmative, these companies have to moderate data. They know that they can be held liable for defamation suits if they supply, like display a third-party content in a way that perpetuates these things, like, for example, social movements, which then means that they're incentivized to just display everything in a jumble so that people don't catch these things, and there's no way for them to sue for defamation in the first place.
What? So they put, what is putting everything in a jumble mean?
Yeah, it specifically means that things like hashtags aren't able to be utilized, data isn't as organized. So if I, for example, want to find information on Black Lives Matter, I won't be able to search for that specifically. Rather, everything just gets displayed in one massive wall.
Why can't I search for like Black Lives Matter even if the hashtag doesn't exist?
Yeah, it's specifically because they're scared of the liability that comes with defamation suits for propagating these movements, so they make it much more difficult to access. That's what Granix says.
It doesn't answer my question.
It has, and we've had a couple of follow-ups, so I'm going to take one.
Yeah, go for it.
So, let's talk about the framework. What specific threats is your Jackson evidence criticizing?
Think threats like digital authoritarianism.
Where does it say
taking over the
digital
world.
authoritarianism?
It's talking about crisis politics like yours. It's
Wait, I'm asking you
generalization.
specifically from the evidence, what threats is it talking
You're right,
about?
Jackson doesn't analyze every single extinction impact. What Jackson does say is he takes every single one into account and says even with them all, even if all of them are true, the likelihood of extinction is like 0.00000.
One, we're not going for an extinction impact. Our case was just SB.
Cool.
Second, you're also not answering my
What was your
question,
impact on
which is
C2?
I just said we're not going for it. You can read other
Right,
inputs.
well,
But second,
wait,
and
where
more
was the
importantly,
genocide impact?
it was in the Brand's evidence. Can I get a question? So, Jackson specifically, read me lines that where Jackson is analyzing specific threats. What are those threats?
Threats like authoritarianism.
Cool.
taking
Read
over
me a
the
line.
entire word. I
Read
want
me
my
a line.
laptop pulled up.
All
And that
right.
also doesn't answer my other like thing that I said, is that it says broadly, you can take all of the big fear-mongering arguments like global authoritarianism, you can put them together, and the likelihood of that causing extinction is still completely negligible. I'm gonna
There's
take a
nowhere
question.
that Jackson talks about authoritarianism, but yeah, you can have a
I'm
question.
pretty sure it does specifically talk about authoritarianism, but
I'll
either
read a
way,
line, but that's
the-
fine. You can have a question.
my laptop is not, I read it in case it's read. Let's talk about your case.
Yeah.
So I'm jumbling. Why does seeing, like, I don't understand this. So now no one's able to find any content that they want online?
Yeah.
Like, so all search engines just go away?
Yeah.
Google goes away?
Well, Google doesn't go away, but Google becomes a lot more difficult to navigate.
What
That's
does that mean?
specifically what the Granite evidence says. Yeah, it means that you're not able to search for things like keywords. You're not able to access hashtags specifically talking about social movements.
People are
You
gonna
have-
see the stuff, even if it's jumbled, some people are
Okay,
still gonna see the
That's
stuff.
cross. You should have made that response in your phone.
It was in the bubble.
Alright. We'll take some more prep starting now. That was 105 used, 135, 105, 240, 20 left. Oh wait, we'll take a little bit. Yeah, we're good. Framing, our case. All right. The time began. Now, structural balance comes first. Jackson has a big stick impacts of the affirmative voice to track all the urgency away from solving that structural balance, so they have no chance of having qualifies the politician use big stick fears to ignore as structural balance. And we've has institutionally shut out voices and marginalized. Be a big stick. We never going to talk about how they actually solve for high probability ongoing social violence. They only read responses saying that they link it because of China. But what Jackson literally says is the threat of China is a big stick impact, which we should try to avoid, which means that's both the impacts of their case. Because the first one is about dismantling autocracies, but the biggest autocracy and the biggest challenge is China per their own evidence saying that's very hot general state. But then on C2 digital authoritarianism, we're talking about Chinese power using hegemon having genocide causing. Jackson specifically says the threat of China is one of the big threats that we should try to avoid and look towards ongoing structural violence in the first place. That is whole conceived correctly around. They've read an alternative to structural violence. I mean, first as far as that doesn't link to structural violence, they can't win the round whatsoever. This game over. Their only response is that like terrorism's back is a threat construction. But our impact is specific about small threat terror, not like a big state collapse terror. What Jackson says is big state collapse terror is like nuclear weapons is a bad thing, not like individual attacks. But even then, we're not even going for that. Go for our C1, on our C1, they return. We would tell you that Gredlick happens no matter what, which means that there's always not unique. It's a large polarization right now. They have no impact off their turn. Then on, we're going to quickly frontline C3 on terror first. They try and tell you that's unlikely. That means that kicks out their first turn. On their second turn about moderation bias, that's literally just their case. We'll respond to it there. With that being said, extend contention 2. Contention 2 is tracking. And Trader says that there's 125% increase in traffic on Facebook and 95% increase on Instagram. So sometimes companies have to disincentive to moderate as they have the liabilities. Cyber towards it, these cases constantly. If Section 230s are killed, the immunity would no longer send these cases, and companies would face massive legal liability, making them take it down. UNODC finds the internet is the most common place where victim recruitment takes place, and also finds that students with depression and PTSD report by 78% of women survivors. They read 4 responses. First, I tell you that it's on the decline right now. Even if it's on the decline right now, Sarah would really challenge that anywhere the most place that happens trafficking would be the best thing to do in the world, which is the internet. But secondly, they try to say it's worse thing for like making work a lot more dangerous. But no, what we would tell you is that a lot less people would go into these situations in the first place. It's a lot easier for recruitment to happen online. We're not just talking about sex workers, but people who are trying to find jobs on side job boards and they're getting accidentally recruited into this. But what we would also tell you is that's not any more dangerous to do it versus online because you still don't know who you're making up with. These everyone's on online. Then on the turn about offering, what we tell you is that insofar as they're going to underground networks, that means that decreases the scope of trafficking a lot more, and there's no one solving for safe measure right now, which means that it doesn't matter insofar as a big company or a small company, insofar as no one's solving, and there's no like law enforcement being able to solve this issue. But then on survivor identification, we should probably stop it from happening in the first place insofar as we can solve. That means that we don't have to retroactively look back and try to solve like the identification means we'll stop trafficking from happening in the first place, which is overall a lot better because even if identification happens, it doesn't mean you don't stop trafficking in the future. The effort's already done. Then go into the language. We use that intervening actors come first under structural balance. What we tell you is that there are no intervening actors are trying to look for stuff like trafficking. There's a bunch of intervening actors looking for initial errands about social movements and digital authoritarianism, which is why you should prefer this under the structural balance. It's already conceded about the threat of China. Then go into their case. On the top, extend the appeals. What we tell you is that people can always appeal the process, which means that they keep their posts up. They try and tell you that they don't have enough resources to do this. No, you just click a button on social media. It's not that hard to do. But secondly, they consider they destroy the model, which makes that a lot worse. They try and tell that people would litigate, but what we tell you is that destroying the model is a lot worse than litigation suits. They already dealing with litigation suits, so just a little bit more money is destroying all their platforms. But then digital authoritarianism, what we tell you that no, it's specific to the EU. They embrace up with the EU like climate change things it's triggered, but they rely on the US for like protection of safety, which means that they will never cut off full ties with the EU and the US.
We have 2 of them left.
Read that to me.
That was 1, 2, 4, so you have 10 seconds left. Where my speech is going to start is just on the framework debate, our case to case. Everyone ready? Great. Start on the framework debate. On Jackson, we're not going for any big stick impacts. We're just saying social movements are good. But even if we read China, they read terror, and they can see that that was a big stick impact, so they can't make this a voting issue. But then on this argument about trafficking, they are specifically reading trafficking in their own rhetoric is that everyone is susceptible to trafficking because they're all on the internet. That is inherently a big stick impact because they don't talk about how this specifically affects marginalized groups or they're specifically vulnerable, meaning that they can't even go for this argument under their own framework where social movements are specifically for marginalized groups, and it's the best way to link into the Jackson analysis. But even then, on the intervening actors wing, we'd say that they can't even name an intervening actor that was all that for BLM. At that point, they have no probability, but the UN and PCOs can always stop trafficking. They already have plans to expand that. But then, for our arguments on a LinkedIn, when social movements happen, that means that they've been told that for trafficking because you can bring more awareness to it and actually cause authoritarian governments to stop the allowance of it and stop facilitating it. Preferred on scope because they talk about trafficking in just people that are using social media and just people using the United States platforms. We're talking about trafficking online, but also in person globally. We're reading on scope. But then, on social movements specifically, they go for the first response about moderation. They concede the fact that once you repeal Section 230, these companies are held liable. That's their own link, meaning that they are bogged down in moderation and they're just going to censor everything because they're going to see a flood of defamation suits. They say that they're going to be appealed, but no, the defamation suits are much more likely to occur because people feel that they now have any reason to sue these companies, so it's outweighing them on scope. But then they've conceded democracy is flourishing and social movements are up. That means that the negative world is solving, but the repeal causes the crackdown on things like BLM videos and Me Too, stopping social movements and allowing that momentum to happen. We're not going for our second link, so they can't extend anything on models. But then that spills over because when the United States cracks down on social movements, it's the best way to stop authoritarian regimes from being discriminatory and cracking down on marginalized groups. Diamond fines that allows for genocide to occur, and that is the worst possible link into structural violence because it is literally the extinction of a marginalized group that's detrimental and irreversible. But then that means that it causes that global authoritarian impact, and that's terrible for the framework. But even then, On this argument about C2, we're not going for it, so you're still not gonna be voting there. Preferred on probability, because they have conceded that after these social movements have started to flourish, that caused BLM to be extremely successful, leading to 140 reforms in the United States, proving the probability of our argument to be true, that it changes authoritarian regimes, whereas in COVID, you saw people transition to online platforms after using in-person means, so they are winning probability of solving for all of trafficking, but specifically on trafficking. Because of that COVID example, their own uniqueness says they're shifting to COVID because they're shifting to online because of the pandemic. That means that after the pandemic, they'll shift to other means. That means that the only solvency that's made on trafficking is with the net, because when people are using social media platforms, you can always trace the victims and be able to prosecute them looking at receipts. Whereas in person, it is very, very hard to identify these victims and be able to solve that for it. Even if it's after the fact, they don't solve that for all of trafficking, but being able to identify it will, because therefore you can stop the traffickers before they can proliferate harms. We negate.
Right, we'll start, Brad.
What was the next? What was the last group?
Alright, kind of question.
Yeah, let us know.
Yes. No, I was just pointing to stuff. Alright, first question. Alright, time starts now. Alright, so what's your terminal impact of social movements?
Studies has like 140 reforms overall, decreasing the negative harms to Black Americans from police brutality.
That's the terminal impact, that's all you're going for?
And additionally, solving back for trafficking and being able to hold governments.
Okay, so you're just going for.
And being able to hold governments committing genocide accountable by allowing for social
Okay.
movements.
So you're also going for movements in the US are going to cause authoritarian governments to change their policies, which will decrease genocides in the international world. You're also going for that link?
No, what we're saying is that social movements are good because they solve back for anyone trying to commit genocide on people, but we also.
So section 230 will create enough social movements to stop authoritarian dictators from continuing to export their genocidal state.
Well, yeah.
Is that not big stick? Do you not see a problem with that?
No, you haven't defined what is big stick. You
Yeah, we did. We said an existential threat is some. Yeah.
We didn't make an existential argument. We never said that. All we said is that genocide is the extinction of a culture. That is not the same as making an extinction level impact, because the culture and the history gets eradicated.
Sure.
It's very different.
Yeah, okay, the problem is that is the definition of a crisis.
No,
A crisis-based politics, which is exactly what Jackson and McDonald talk about, is something in which a crisis occurs. The genocide of an entire group of people would be a crisis.
So hold on, under your framework, we shouldn't consider impacts about genocide?
Because it's no probability, which Jackson tells you is one big threat designed to distract you from the actual form of structural violence that occurred.
Wait, that is not true. Genocide is very, very real.
Yeah, the problem is the way that you're getting to genocide, the problem is, okay, this is the problem. The way that you're getting to genocide is through going through elite voices.
What about
McDonald
Jackson
tells
says
you,
that is not, like, what are the elite voices we're going
McDonald tells you that when you're prioritizing the elite voices through the big stick impact to try and solve for things like structural violence underlying, right? That means that you're not actually focusing on the marginalized voices that are being silenced in the first place. So by circumventing genocide,
I'd really like to get an answer. To clarify real quick, our argument is that grassroots movements from marginalized groups check back upon abuses of government power in the form of genocide.
Yeah.
The only elites are the ones committing genocide.
Yeah.
Who our argument.
So you're going through the elites to try and solve for the small voices.
No,
McDonald tells you that that's a bad idea because going through that has low probability. You're silencing the minorities that will always have structural violence.
We're not going through elites. We're giving the agency to the marginalized groups to have protests and check back against governments however they see fit. That's just our link.
You got a question?
Yeah, sure. So let's talk about, good question.
Oh, yeah, so on trafficking, why don't NGOs resolve the impact? Like, why
so
aren't
the
those
problem,
intervening?
yes. So first off, it wasn't either of speeches, so I don't know why you're bringing this up
Yeah,
now.
it
But
was
secondly, it was not somewhere. It
Yeah,
did say.
Maybe you didn't follow, but
But
it was.
secondly, it wasn't. Anyway, but secondly, what we tell you is that none of those organizations can actually solve because it's all well concealed, whereas people can solve for things like social movements because that's above surface.
Framing artistic, framing laying artistic.
Extend the framing. Jackson finds that big stick impacts like the affirmative always attract all the energy from solving for structural violence, so that they have no chance of happening. Cuomo finds that politicians use big stick fears for to ignore structural violence. McDonald finds that institutionally shut up voices of the marginalized via big stick we never get to talk about and solve for high probability ongoing slow violence. So for once we need to intentionally shift the urgency towards SV, which is Olson concludes to enforce necessary dialogue on politics for implementation. Their response is that they are a big stick. Yes, they are. They have conceded that the internal link into their impact is literally global authoritarianism is going to spill over and do massive genocide. They are not telling you why social movements inside of U.S. genocide globally, but secondly, it is still relying on the elites. What our evidence tells you is that it's still contingent on finding out if these elites are going to do the genocide or not, which is bad because it empirically ignores real-world structural violence. Okay, you have to look at the doc they send. The link into all of their structural violence is reliant on big stick. Go to the way. They say trafficking is big stick. It inherently isn't. It's talking about marginalized people that empirically get empirically get put on the chopping block. The second they say is that social movements as a prerequisite to solve back who is protesting trafficking. They can give you an example of one social movement that's looking towards human trafficking. They say they say that no actors would solve back. Yes, they can. BLM is the actor that solved back for their case. What our evidence indicates that these forms and these social movements always go to and find other ways to actually be able to check back. But you know that no intervening actors are going to step up in the affirmative world for our argument about trafficking because it's so concealed and hidden, but there's always ways to decrease genocide and also for their own analysis. The next thing they say is that theirs is global. There's literally no warrant as to why this is implicated, but also ours is also global. It's about trafficking that can happen all across the world. And the final thing they say is that genocide is worse. There's no warrant. Trafficking is literally the worst thing that can happen to someone for all time. Extend trafficking. Conscious length is 125% increase in trafficking on Facebook, 95% of Instagram, but the distance and the moderate no liability countries have dismissed trafficking case constantly. Section 230 50 usually no longer said the trafficking case companies would face massive liability. The internet's most common place for trafficking, depression, and PTSD were reported by 78% of women. On their case, extend. Oh, they're one say it's decreased in check, the other means no, they're actively using it in the status code on their turn. It's proactive, it's reactive, not proactive.
Cool. We have 10 seconds of prep. We'll need that starting. Okay, so it's gonna start on their case on trafficking, and then it's gonna be like framework / weighing, and then it'll be social movements at the end. Is anyone not ready? Cool. Regardless of the framing debate, they have conceded a turn on trafficking, which they themselves have told you links into their framework. Let's extend it. Remember, their evidence says the increase in online trafficking was because of the pandemic, but right now traffickers are shifting back to in-person means. Devastatingly, when we moderate all of the content, it means that we're no longer able to get receipts and things to actually track trafficking victims, which means that law enforcement can check back on them in the long run, which our Albert evidence finds historically worked. They just say it's reactive, not proactive. Literally no warrant. We are proactively finding these survivors in our world. This is just semantics. And they've conceded the magnitude weighing that it means that we solve for way more people because the majority of trafficking isn't happening online anymore. Then, on the framework debate, our argument is that grassroots movements are able to check back against abuses of power and correct for instances of structural violence. The internal link we'll go for is the Daniels evidence that that social movements led to much better outcomes for people of color and led to 140 reforms. And they've also led to movements against trafficking. They say we don't have an example. Yes, we do. The World Day of Trafficking is a global protest that checks back on that, but you silence information about that in the world of the affirmative. At that point, there is no explanation of how what we are doing is crisis politics. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Then, on the intervening actors weighing, they've conceded the UN, NGOs, peacekeeping operations all check back for trafficking, whereas the only intervening actor they can name is BLM, who they conceded gets censored in the world of the affirmative. But then, go to our case. Pretty simple here, 100% probability. The linkage is conceded in their last speech. Globally, democracy and protests are increasing right now, so you probably air neck on uniqueness. But in the world of the affirmative, social media companies are liable for third-party content. They're scared of defamation suits surrounding social movements like BLM, so they just censor all of the content, meaning that movements are no longer able to organize. They're not able to do things like protests that check back on abuses such as police killings and trafficking. And you prefer our arguments on probability. They have conceded that BLM is currently being successful. There are 140 reforms, whereas you know the only reason why trafficking is up online is because of COVID, which is an inherently short-term issue. We don't need to go for any of the offense on genocide or democracy insofar as they have conceded a turn to their case. That links into framework. The round is very simple.